66 winters behind me, and this one is the heaviest. Gray sky, restless wind, dirt thudding on a wooden lid. I hold myself like widows do, chin up, hands folded, grief kept private. The pastor fades to a hush, my phone trembles. Unknown number. 2 sentences.
I'm still alive. Honey, trust no one.
My thumb moves before my courage does. I type, "Who are you?" The reply snaps back.
I can't say. They're watching us. Don't trust the children.
For a breath, I forget how to breathe. I look at the 2 men I raised from fevers and scraped knees to tailored suits and careful condolences. Their faces are steady. Their eyes avoid mine. Inside me, love steps aside and something older instinct takes its chair. The ground under this funeral feels hollow. If mercy is honest, it asks the hardest question, what if he isn't the one we buried? If you want to know what happens next, keep listening. Stay with me. I was 24, mending blouses for ladies on Maple Street, when grease-stained hands and a shy smile changed my orbit. Ed stepped out of his father's bicycle shop, sunlight catching the silver in his lashes. "Morning," he said, gentle as a hymn. I didn't own a bicycle, but I invented a loose chain to keep him talking. Spring Creek was small, dusty lanes, church bells, the milkman's whistle. Yet the world felt wide when I walked past his window, and he lifted a hand like I'd been expected. We traded small favors, him fixing my mother's wobbling chair, me patching his shirt where the pocket tore. Under the oak at Oakleaf Park, we sat with paper cups of coffee, promising things poor people promise: work hard, save dimes, be kind. I knew how thin money could stretch and how quickly it snapped. But Ed's voice made poverty feel like weather, something we could dress for, hold hands through, and outlast, together. We married without lace, just a plain dress, a rented suit, and the pastor's hands blessing our stubborn hope. Our house had a tin roof that sang loud in the rain. So we set out pots in a tidy line, each plink like a clock marking our new life. Ed fixed bikes from sunup, oil darkening his fingerprints. I took in hems by the window, measuring skirts with twine. We learned the language of small economies, last night's stew stretched with a potato, a quilt pieced from shirts too tired for Sunday. Neighbors waved when we swept the porch. Some nights the power flickered, and we read by a stubborn candle, our shadows leaning together on the wall like they were already old. We were not rich, but there was a fullness to the day's bread rising, coffee perking, Ed's whistle off-key that made me brave. Happiness didn't arrive with trumpets. It came like warm bread and left fingerprints of flour on our hearts. When Dan was born, I learned how a cry can be music. He had his father's wide eyes and a fist that refused surrender. 2 years later, Mike slid into our lives like a quiet answer to an unspoken prayer. Ed carried both boys around the shop, naming tools like saints, letting small hands touch the harmless ones. Sundays meant river water up to our knees, the smell of worms and the patient art of waiting. I stitched tiny patches on tiny jeans and kissed the scabs that proved they'd been brave. Nights were exhausted and golden, one boy against my shoulder, the other against Ed's chest, the house clicking and settling like it was pleased. I believed our future would be as steady as the rhythm of Ed's boots on the boards. As sure as sunrise over the foothills, children don't stay small, everyone said. I nodded politely, secretly certain we would outrun whatever grew between us. Ambition announced itself early in Dan, not with cruelty but with questions that stung. Why don't we have a car, like the Jenkins? Why is the roof so loud when it rains? Ed offered him the shop, a place at the workbench, the honor of hands that fix what's broken. Dan wrinkled his nose, a boy already practicing for a boardroom. I don't want to get dirty, he said, and something quiet inside Ed flinched. I watched my husband study the sky that evening, counting stars like a man tallying receipts. Not for money, but for meaning. I told myself it was normal for sons to dream beyond the fence line. We clipped coupons, tucked away dollars, Bought Dan a decent suit for his interviews. When he left for the city, I packed sandwiches and my best prayers. Pride and ache rode the bus with him. At the station, he hugged me quick, like time was expensive. Mike, my moonchild, orbited his brother like tide. Where Dan stepped, Mike's footprints trailed, smaller but sure. He borrowed Dan's words until they sounded like his own investments. Markets, leverage terms that fit awkwardly in a kitchen that still smelled of starch and soap. He visited less, thanked me with a credit card smile, and left before my coffee finished steeping. Ed kept a place for him at the bench anyway. A clean rag folded like an invitation. Any time, he'd say, not pleading, just open. The shop bell rang for other people's boys, teenagers who wanted a tube, hatched and stayed for a story. I fed them pie, pretending not to notice the empty seats that used to belong to mine. When Mike finally wore a suit that didn't slouch on his shoulders, he looked like a man halfway between pride and permission. Big meeting, he'd say, tapping his watch. I nodded, smoothing a wrinkle that wasn't in the fabric. Distance doesn't always slam the door. Sometimes it loosens the hinges. Calls grew shorter, visits scheduled like meetings with agendas and exit times. They arrived in polished cars that didn't fit our gravel, stepped around puddles like poverty might splash. We set the good plates for them, the ones with the blue flowers, and their compliments felt like air kisses polite. Weightless, gone. Ed asked about their lives. They answered in headlines. I told stories about Mrs. Wilcox's hem mishap and the way the maple out back leaned toward the light. Their eyes slid elsewhere. After they left, I washed cups heavy with silence and told myself, this is how success sounds from the other side of a screen door. Ed sat on the porch and tuned a radio to the old station, letting weather reports and farm prices remind us who we were. They're busy, I said. Busy isn't the same as gone, he answered, voice soft, worried. Olivia stepped onto our porch in heels that sank into Colorado dirt. Red dress bright as a stop sign. She offered the tips of her fingers and a curated smile. Her eyes took inventory chipped paint. Quilted cushion, the hem of the screen door hinge. I served meatloaf and buttered corn, the meal my mother served company. Olivia moved food around like it needed rearranging. Dan apologized for us with his eyes, which is a crueler thing than words. After dinner, I stacked plates that still looked fed and listened from the sink as he whispered, next time, a restaurant. Ed wiped his hands on a towel and asked about her work. She named neighborhoods, square footage, margins. I nodded like I belonged in that arithmetic. Olivia laughed prettily when the house creaked and checked her phone under her veil of manners. Cold can live inside a smile. That night, I added another blanket to the bed. The suggestion came wrapped in care brochures for retirement communities. Pages shining with gardens and scheduled joy. You'd have company, Dan said. Medical staff, Olivia added, sweet as frost. Mike nodded like a metronome set to firm. I held the paper between my thumb and forefinger, careful not to smudge the promise. Our house had its scuffs and its stubborn windows, but it knew our footsteps. It knew where Christmas had stood and where fever had broken. It would be easier. Dan pressed, easier for whom I pictured our chairs on a porch that wasn't ours. The polite smell of shared hallways. My sewing machine silent in a closet labeled storage. Ed cleared his throat. We're fine where we are. His voice was not loud, but it had a backbone. The temperature in the room dropped a degree you couldn't see, but could feel in the wrists. I smiled and set the brochure under the sugar bowl. Paperwork arrived pre-printed, numbers stacked like brick. We can list it fast, Dan said. The way a man says we can pull this tooth. Mike traced the property line on a glossy map, as if borders could explain a home. Our roof needed love. Our porch steps complained. The kitchen window stuck on humid days, but every flaw had a story stitched to it. I ran a palm over the dining table where math homework dented the wood, where Ed's elbows had polished the grain. They talked about comps and inspections, better places, better value. as if better were a place you could move into without leaving anything behind. "This isn't an investment," I said, surprised at how even my voice sounded. "It's where our life happened." Ed didn't argue. He just folded the papers once, then again, and slid them back. It's a small miracle, the courage it takes to keep what's yours when love starts sounding like a sales pitch. That night, the porch felt like a confessional. Ed watched the sky the way old men watch their fields, measuring what might be lost. "It's not the money," he said, thumb rubbing the worn arm of his chair. "It's what the money made them forget." I wanted to argue, to stack excuses like firewood deadlines, city miles, the gravity of new lives. Instead, I listened to the insect choir and the quiet between us. He was 70 then, hands still nicked from work, the map of our years inked into his skin. "They'll come around." I tried. He nodded, a kindness to my hope. In the window, I saw our reflections, two people who had traded time for love and were counting the cost without regret. I brought him coffee in the chipped mug that said, "Good morning," in a faded cheerfulness. He smiled anyway. "As long as you're here," he said. "None of this feels empty. Warnings don't always arrive with sirens. Sometimes they come as glances you can't name." Dan began visiting alone. Sentences trimmed too neatly. "No matter what happens," he said once, and the phrase hung in the kitchen like a draft. Mike checked on our insurance, not our health. Not our needs, our insurance. Olivia's laughter at a dinner party slid off my back and left me cold. The shop's ledger went missing for a day, then returned to the wrong drawer. Ed wrote himself notes he didn't usually need, and I found one near the sink. "Be careful." I told myself I was being dramatic. Mothers magnify. That's what we do with worry and love. I folded towels tighter, stirred soup longer, waited for the feeling to pass. Ed kissed my forehead and asked if I slept, like a stone. I lied. Stones don't dream. I did. And in those dreams, the house had unfamiliar footsteps. There is a hush that comes before weather turns, a stillness that makes birds reconsider their plans. The week before everything broke open, the house felt like a held breath. I ironed Ed's shirt slow, smoothing collars that already knew the shape of his neck. He tuned the radio to the oldies and pretended not to watch me, watching him. We moved around each other like dancers who know the steps by heart, careful not to tread on the unspoken. In the shop, he lined wrenches by size, wiped a clean rag cleaner, checked a machine that needed no checking. I baked a pie for no reason but memory. The crust blistered just right, and we ate it warm, nodding at sweetness we didn't quite taste. Outside, the maple leaned toward the light, insistently kind. Inside, I set my phone on the table and tried not to notice the way silence had started to ring. The house was too quiet when the phone rang our old landline with its honest bell. I answered with dishwater on my hands. A voice I didn't know asked for me by my maiden steadiness. "There's been an accident at the shop." The word accident fell like a wrench on concrete. "Your husband is at Memorial General. You should come." My keys slipped, clattered to the floor like they didn't want the job. I wiped my hands on the dish towel and couldn't remember where I kept my purse, though I've kept it in the same drawer for 20 years. Outside, the afternoon looked normal, which felt like a betrayal. I told Linda across the street I needed a ride. She grabbed her sweater without questions. The kind of friend who knows when silence does the heavy lifting. On the way, I prayed small prayers patchwork, uneven asking God to give Ed back the breath he'd once lent our boys when fevers ran high. Hospitals smell like bleach and borrowed time. Machines made a meadow of beeps around Ed, a fragile landscape stitched with wires. His face was bandaged, leaving a map of clean skin where my eyes could land. I took his hand. It was warm, defying the room's metallic chill. "I'm here," I said, the way I said it when storms rattled our tin roof. The nurse called me on, which helped and hurt. 5 minutes, she said, 5 minutes to pour 42 years into his palm. Ed's eyelids fluttered as if something behind them was remembering how to come back. I leaned close enough to share breath. "Follow my voice," I whispered, "the way you follow the porch light home." A thread of pressure returned my squeeze, small, stubborn, real. The nurse glanced at the monitor. Involuntary, she warned. Maybe. Or maybe a signal from the deep places love won't let go. I chose the second truth and held on. Grief has a way of thinning the walls between conversations. In the family room, I heard my sons before I saw them, paper whisper, pen click, a vocabulary made of numbers. Dan's voice was low, practiced. Policy says 50. Mike answered with a soft scrape of calculation. I stepped in, a mother in sensible shoes, and the air stiffened like starch. "Mom," Dan said brightly, too brightly, "we're just making sure things are covered, as if life fit under a tarp." I looked through the glass at Ed's silhouette under wires and winter light. "Your father is breathing," I said. "Talk to him, not the paperwork." They nodded, but their eyes were already elsewhere, scanning a horizon I couldn't see. On the second day, Dan asked about beneficiaries. The word sounded clinical, cold, like a chair with no cushion. I sat beside Ed and counted the rise and fall beneath the sheet, choosing pulse over policy. They ushered me into a small consultation room that had tried for comfort soft chairs, a watercolor of the mountains, but couldn't quite forget what it was for. Dr. James Patterson folded his hands, his gaze kind but steady. He explained infection, swelling, the stubbornness of head injuries. He didn't say hopeless, he said very low chances, and the difference felt like a thin blanket against January. "We can continue supportive care," he said, "but if you've had conversations about his wishes..." Wishes? We talked once, over meatloaf, about not wanting machines to decide our last chapter. But we were still writing, weren't we? "I'm not ready to let go," I said, surprised by the iron in my voice. He nodded, not arguing, simply marking the path I chose with a pencil only I could see. As I stood, my knees trembled and then remembered their work. In the hall, I pinched my earlobe, my old trick to keep from breaking. They found me in the corridor, Dan with concern arranged on his face, Mike with sympathy folded neatly at the corners. "Mom," Dan began, "we have to be practical. Dad wouldn't want to be a burden." The word struck like a slap. Burden. As if the man who held fevers and fixed chains could weigh too much for the people he taught to stand. "He is not a burden," I said, and my voice carried farther than I meant. Clear as a bell rung for supper. A nurse paused. Someone looked up. "I didn't care. He is your father." Mike lifted his palms. "Peacemaker by habit. We're thinking of you," he said. I had a sudden memory of their toddler hands, sticky with jam, reaching for my face like I was the air. Love is gentle until it isn't. Love grows teeth when it must. I squared my shoulders, walked back to Ed, and kept vigil. Night flattens hospitals into long, humming tunnels. I sat by Ed while the ward settled into its mechanical lullaby. "If you can hear me," I said, "give me something small." The room answered with nothing at first, just soft pumps and the faraway wheel of a cart. Then his lips moved no sound, a shape of a word that never caught air. The nurse checked the monitors, shook her head kindly. Sometimes muscles misfire. Maybe, or maybe a man trying to push a message through fog. I bent closer, cheek to the edge of his bandage, and spoke plain the house. The boys, the porch radio, the way coffee tastes better from the chipped mug. I offered him our life like a rope. His fingers twitched inside mine, not a spasm but a decision. Thin as fishing line, strong as promise. "I'm here." I told him again, if science needed a name, it could keep it. I named it Trying. Grief tells time by alarms, at 4:37 a.m. And the monitors changed their song one note long and unarguable. Nurses filled the doorway like a storm that knows its job. I stepped back because there is a choreography to endings, and the living must make room. They worked in swift mercy. I counted the tiles on the floor so the world would not tip. When the doctor touched my shoulder, I recognized the weight before he spoke. "I'm sorry," he said, and the sentence did not need verbs beyond that. After, I pressed my forehead to Ed's bandaged temple and learned how goodbye can be spoken without words. Outside, the parking lot lights kept pretending it was day. Linda drove me home while Dawn considered whether to bother. In our kitchen, the clock ticked like always, and I realized what had changed for the first time in my life. There was no we, only I, and a house full of us. Dan moved quickly, like urgency proved love. "I've got a funeral home on standby," he said, offering me choices that felt pre-chosen. The casket catalog flipped past my fingers laminate wood with names that wanted to sound like forests. "Simple," he urged. "It's what Dad would have wanted." Maybe, but simple should be tender, not rushed. Mike handled logistics with the competence of a man finishing a project. Times, fees, signatures. I felt like a guest at my own loss when I asked about inviting the men from the shop, the neighbors who borrowed Ed's tools more than once. Dan hesitated. "Small service," he said. "Intimate. Intimate is a fine word until it means empty." I signed where they told me and then set the pen down as if it had burned me. Love deserves a long table, not a takeout box. Still, I let the machinery move, telling myself my real work was elsewhere, keeping Ed near until I could let him go. Clouds kept their side of the bargain. The pastor read from Psalms, the wind underlined the verses. Chairs stood in rows that didn't fill. I searched faces for the shop boys, for Mr. Avery from the hardware, for the neighbor whose lawnmower Ed revived each June. Absences made a pattern I couldn't unsee. Dan checked his watch as if time might argue with him. Mike's jaw worked, busy with thoughts he wouldn't feed words. Olivia dabbed eyes that didn't redden. I wanted to be generous. Grief is strange on everyone, but generosity has ears, and mine heard impatience wearing black. When the first shovelful of dirt struck the casket, the sound ran straight through my marrow. I steadied myself with the edge of the folding chair. The pastor said ashes to ashes, and something in me whispered, "Are we burying a man or a story someone needs gone?" The phone in my purse began its small earthquake. I shouldn't have answered at a graveside. I did. Unknown number, 2 sentences, bright as a flare against the gray. "I'm still alive. Honey, trust no one." My thumb answered before I decided to be brave. "Who are you?" The reply, "I can't say. They're watching us." "Don't trust the children." The words rearranged the ground. I looked at Dan, at Mike, my boys whose fevered foreheads I once cooled with damp cloths, standing so straight they might snap. Their eyes slid past mine like boats refusing a dock. Cold traveled my spine, careful and complete. People think betrayal arrives like lightning. Sometimes it arrives as punctuation at the end of a message you never wanted. I tucked the phone away and folded my grief in half so it could make room for suspicion. If this was a cruel joke, it had perfect aim. If it wasn't, everything we were was about to be tested. I set the phone on the kitchen table beside Ed's glasses, the old ones with the scratch on the left lens. I spread documents like a quilt, policies, receipts. The new folder Dan had pressed into my hands and traced the seams. Why had they reached the hospital before Linda and I? When the nurse called me first, why had Dan known which funeral home to call without looking at a list? I reread the policy changes and felt my stomach list like a boat. Outside, the maple threw shadows long as accusations. I walked from room to room, touching the edges of our life. As if truth left fingerprints, I thought of the shop Ed's order, his rules, his safety lectures that bored boys into rolling their eyes. An explosion. From that man's care, the house made night noises, and I couldn't tell if they were benign. Doubt is a new kind of weather. I reached for my ring and promised myself I'd follow the storm. Before sleep, I turned off every light except the one above the stove, our lighthouse. I stood in its small circle and touched my wedding band, thin gold, dented where life had insisted. "Ed," I said into the quiet kitchen, If there's truth to be found, lead me to it. Prayer doesn't always change the world. Sometimes it changes how you stand in it. I breathed in the scent of coffee grounds and clean dishcloth. Ordinary things that have rescued me before. The phone lay dark on the table, but it felt awake, as if holding a door open to something I didn't yet recognize. I shut the stove light, and in the moment before darkness took the room, I saw our reflections in the window, his shoulder behind mine, by habit. I slept badly, like a soldier taking turns with fear. Morning would ask me to choose accept the tidy story, or listen to the quiet that had started to shout. I chose listening. Susan Thompson met me with the kind of kindness small towns keep in reserve. She slid the statements across the desk, her finger tapping dates like a metronome. January 1000, February 3, March 4. Withdrawals in Ed's name, in person. He told us it was for repairs, she said. Repairs. I balanced nickels like hymn notes. There were no repairs. Susan fetched the authorization slips. Ed's signature looked like it had learned to limp shaky, unsure. Unlike the steady loops I'd watched him sign on county forms for decades. Did he come alone? I asked, trying to sound like a woman who still believed in coincidence. Susan squinted at her memory. Once, maybe twice. Your eldest was with him. The tall one, Dan, said your husband forgot his glasses. Ed didn't forget his glasses. I traced the shaky E with a fingertip and felt my stomach tilt. The air in the bank smelled like lemon polish, and something else a lie that thought it could pass for tidy. They let me view the camera stills just enough to confirm a shape, not enough to soothe. There he was, my son, angled toward his father like a tutor, a hand guiding a pen. I remembered teaching that same hand to hold a crayon. Sometimes he explained forms. Susan offered, trying to be neutral, said the print was small. I heard Dan's voice in my head, that city smooth tone he puts on like a jacket. Let me help, Dad. Help is a generous word, in my mouth. It tasted off, outside, on the sidewalk. I sank onto the bench by the rhododendrons and dialed no one. Ed had told me once, laughing, that his eyes were still cocky. He read the obituaries without squinting. He found typos in menus. Why would he let a son steer his name across paper? I stared at the photograph until the pixels blurred, and the only thing I could see clearly was the angle of intent. At our kitchen table, I laid two policies side by side like mismatched socks. 6 months ago, the life insurance had quietly grown from 5 to 50. 2 months ago, a workers' comp rider appeared like an afterthought with teeth. I could hear Dan's pitch in the language phrases about protection, future security, peace of mind, whose mind mine had no peace. Ed was a careful man, suspicious of anything that promised more than it could explain. He would never have jumped the fence of frugality without telling me why. Paper doesn't blush, but these documents felt red to me. The beneficiary's line gleamed like a lure in shallow water. Who talked you into this, old love? I asked the empty room. I already knew. I could feel fingerprints in the margins. I pressed my palm to the table where Ed used to drum his fingers when he thought, if policies were a plan, someone had circled us like prey. I unlocked the shop expecting a story written in scorch and scrap. The air smelled like oil and order. Wrenches hung by size. The welder's cord coiled like a sleeping snake. The compressor sat innocent in its corner. No burn marks, no twisted metal, no black kiss of smoke on the ceiling. An explosion leaves a temper. This place had polish. I ran my hand along the workbench where sawdust usually salted the edges. Clean, too clean. Ed was tidy, yes, but he was honest, the good kind of messy that proves a day's labor. I leaned on the counter and let the quiet accuse. Accident, they'd said. The word ricocheted around the room and fell dead at my feet. I opened drawers and found nothing but the right tool in the right slot. Perfection can be a kind of lie. I stood in the doorway, letting the bell above it tattle my every move, and felt the first hot thread of anger braid itself to my grief. In the bottom drawer, a tin of old screws, a pencil nub, and a folded page with my name. Ed's handwriting, regular and sure. First, 2 short notes. Dan insists on more insurance. Says it's for Maggie, doesn't feel right. Then, Mike brought papers to modernize the shop. 2 rushed. Beneath them, the letter. If you're reading this, something happened. I love you. Trust your sense, God gave you plenty. I don't like the pressure coming from our boys, especially with Olivia fanning it. If anything goes wrong, don't accept easy answers. The room changed temperature. I sat on the stool where he used to sit, sharpening pencils down to honest nubs, and read his sentences until they memorized me. He had seen the shadow and tried to name it before it swallowed us. I pressed the paper to my chest like a borrowed heartbeat. He had left me a compass, even if he couldn't draw the whole map. Sergeant Mark O'Connell knew Ed from church picnics and roadside tire saves. He met me at his desk with his hat off, respect in his posture. Explosion, he repeated. Flipping through incident logs, his brow knit. We don't have a report. Nothing from the shop. He called the hospital while I sat very straight to keep from shaking. When he hung up, his face had learned a new seriousness. Medical intake mentions poisoning symptoms. They used the word methanol. The syllables were cold in my mouth. Why wasn't I told? He cleared his throat. Immediate family requested confidentiality. Immediate family. My sons. The room turned a slow circle and then pretended it hadn't. Mrs. Hayes. Hyunmi said, voice dropping, if you believe something criminal happened, I'll open a file. Believe I wanted to hand him belief in a jar. Instead, I nodded, careful, like the floor might object. He wrote my statement while the clock ticked like a witness with perfect recall. I went home with pamphlets printed in small. Merciless type, methanol clear, sweet-smelling, treacherous. It blinds first, then steals the brain's footing, then pushes the body toward a cliff it can't see. Symptoms: dizziness, confusion, vision loss, coma. I read about window washers and solvents, about fumes and tainted spirits, about how methanol masquerades as harmless until it isn't. Every sentence made a memory flex. Ed's sudden confusion, the way his eyes moved under closed lids like they were searching for light. An explosion doesn't pretend to be something it's not. Poison does. I set the papers beside Ed's letter and felt the 2 of them agree. The house creaked, ordinary and faithful, and still my skin prickled like it had learned a new weather. Outside, the maple kept leaning toward the light. Inside, I sat very still and pictured a cup of coffee, dark and familiar, carrying a stranger's hand into my husband's blood. They arrived with a bakery bag and a tin of coffee, like hospitality had a script. Your favorite, Olivia said, voice sugared. Dan set the cups on the table, lids already loosened, the gesture of a man who takes care of details. Eat a little, Mike urged. You've lost weight. Grief can take pounds. So can fear. I smiled the way women do when we need to buy a minute. I already had breakfast. I kept my hands folded, my mouth polite. The coffee smelled right, which is not the same as safe. Sit, I offered, and watched them sit like a photograph of concern. We talked weather, arrangements, nothing. When Dan reached for the cup to push it closer, I moved the saucer instead, and our fingers didn't touch. Love used to live in the unthinking ease of our bodies. Now every inch was measured. Thank you, I said softly, and did not drink. Care or staging either way, I would not be rehearsed. They came armed with paperwork this time, folders thick with forms and footnotes. We've been speaking with a specialist. Dan said, Albright, he's reviewed everything. Everything. He had never met me. Mom, you're not yourself, Mike added, gentling his tone the way you do for a horse you mean to bridle. A temporary guardianship would help just until you're steady. I turned the top page. Incompetency petition. Somewhere a kettle began to sing. It was my own blood. You're grieving, Olivia soothed. Let us carry the heavy parts. I remembered their jam-sticky hands on my cheeks, the way they once trusted me to name colors and monsters. I'm steady enough to read my own name, I said. The room held its breath. Dan's smile went flat at the edges. We can do this the easy way, he said. Easy is a word that often means our way. I set the pen down and watched the mask slip a fraction. I brought out 3 mugs and poured plain water to give my hands a job. Tell me about the explosion report, I said. Sergeant O'Connell couldn't find one. The question unbuttoned the room. Dan blinked slow, assembling a story. Mike knocked his knee against the table leg and the coffee sloshed. Not every incident gets filed, Dan tried. Private property, Mike added. Quick and wrong. Serious injuries require reports, I said. A fact older than both of them standing. Silence spread. Olivia studied a crumb on the table as if it held law. I thought of the bank camera, the too clean shop, the altered policies, the word methanol sitting in my chest like a shard of glass. If there was nothing to hide. I asked gently, why hide it? Mike stood too fast, chair legs scraping. You need rest, he said, already reaching for his phone. We're done here, Dan murmured, but his eyes had learned fear's vocabulary. That night, the house kept one light on and I kept my phone nearby, face down like a sleeping witness. Near midnight, it vibrated against the wood, a small, insistent heartbeat. Unknown number again. Don't eat or drink anything they bring. Not ever. The words arrived like a hand on my shoulder, in a dark room, startling and saving all at once. I typed, "Who are you?" and stared at the dots that did not appear. I walked to the sink and dumped the untouched coffees down the drain. It left a ring that refused ordinary soap. I scrubbed until the porcelain forgot it. When I returned to the table, I found my wedding band where I always leave it before dishes. A circle of promise that has outlasted so many storms. I slid it back on and understood the feeling I'd had all day. The noose doesn't tighten fast. It inches closer. Confident you'll mistake it for a scarf. Morning brought clarity braided tight with dread. The next text set place and time, corner cafe. Back table, 3 o'clock. I dressed in my good purple, the dress that makes me feel like I still know my own name, and walked the blocks with my chin level. Every parked car felt like an eye. Inside, steam fogged the windows, spoons chimed in mugs. Nobody cared who I was, which felt like a mercy. At 3 sharp, a man with gray at his temples and honesty in his posture set a brown folder on my table. Mrs. Hayes, I'm Stephen Callahan. His voice made a promise my bones believed. Ed hired me 3 weeks ago, he said, opening the file. He was worried about your sons. The recorder on the table looked small enough to hold a storm. Before you hear this, he warned, breathe. I did. He pressed play, and my husband's voice stepped out of the dark and into the light. Stephen set the brown folder down like it contained a living thing. The little recorder lay on top, harmless as a pebble, deadly as a bullet once thrown. Before you hear this, he said, breathe. I watched his thumb hover, then press. A soft click, a hiss of room tone, then Ed's voice came through, warm and ordinary, as if he were sitting across from me with his elbows on the table. I felt my ribs reach for him. It's dated 3 weeks before, Stephen murmured. I nodded, but I couldn't spare language. Ed began with kindness for the man listening, a habit of his even when afraid. He named dates, names, small changes he'd noticed in our boys. I closed my eyes and let the sound build a bridge. Grief didn't vanish, it made room. The cafe clatter faded, the world narrowed to a waveform blinking green. Whatever you think you know, Stephen said gently, let the tape tell you. The waveform rose and fell like a pulse. If anything happens to me, Ed said, steady as weather, it won't be an accident. He described Dan pushing more insurance phrases copied from brochures. Pressure disguised as prudence. He noted Mike's new interest in routines when coffee's poured. Which mug I reach for, Whether I walk with him to the shop? I can't prove anything, Ed admitted, but my bones know the shape of wrong. He spoke about Olivia's polished questions that always arrived with answers attached. I hired Stephen to listen for me, he added softly, and to look after Maggie if I can't. My name in his mouth unstitched me and then sewed me back up. Stephen paused the tape so I could swallow the ache. He was precise, Stephen said. He knew the difference between fear and suspicion. I nodded. Ed had left breadcrumbs in complete sentences. The path away from denial was lit by his voice. Stephen cued the next file, a door shut, footsteps, the rustle of a jacket, and Dan's voice, familiar and foreign at once. I already have the methanol, he said, low and quick, like someone ordering a sin, not a sandwich. It reads like a stroke, no questions. The room inside the recording had its own weather, the faint hum of our refrigerator, the squeak of the third stair. It was my house, my air, betraying me with physics. I gripped the edge of the table until my fingers remembered color. He went on about timing, about making it look merciful. My throat folded. I pictured his kindergarten shoes lined by the door. His first lost tooth held out to me like treasure. Love doesn't erase truth, it makes it heavier. Keep listening, Stephen said, not unkind. He knew what it costs a mother to let evidence call her child by his full name guilty. Another file, Mike's voice, younger, eager to please the worst idea in the room. Tomorrow, in Dad's coffee, he said, as if confirming a meeting time. He repeated what Dan had told him symptoms, the way confusion becomes a story people accept. Mom won't question it, he added, and the sentence cut cleanly through my trust. I could hear a spoon against a mug, the sound so domestic, it made me want to scrub my own kitchen with fire. Stephen's eyes found mine, steadying. There's more, he warned, and I let the warning in. The file ended with a scrape of chair legs and a casual laugh that didn't belong to any man I had raised. The recorder between us felt like a small, honest judge. I thought of Ed asking the boys to sand boards with the grain, to respect how wood tells you what it is. They had ignored grain and chosen speed. The splinters were ours. Stephen slid photographs across the table dates stamped neat in red. Dan outside a hardware store 30 miles out, hat pulled low, a small brown bag in hand. A receipt solvent, cash purchase, no loyalty number, careful anonymity. Clerk remembers him. Stephen said, the car, the way he avoided the camera. He added screenshots of searches tied to a burner phone methanol poisoning. Time to symptoms, life insurance payout timeline. Evidence doesn't tremble. It doesn't apologize. It just stands there being true. My hands shook anyway. He showed me a still from our kitchen camera, Dan's profile by the counter, Mike's shadow in the doorway, the two of them orbiting a steaming cup. We'll chain custody all of this, Stephen said. Law has its rituals. I found comfort in their boredom. Facts lined up like soldiers. I felt a hollow open in my chest, and into that hollow walked a single thought with boots on proceed. Out came spreadsheets, balances, due dates, the creeping interest that eats the edges of a life. Dan owed $70 to a lender whose letters didn't bother with niceties. Mike bled $40 into tables he kept promising to leave. Text threads scrolled past deadlines, threats, a photo of a bruised doorframe where someone knocked like a warning. They were cornered, Stephen said, not offering sympathy, merely geometry. Corners don't make killers, choices do. But desperation explains the quickness of their cruelty, the way they'd shaved love down into arithmetic. I traced the columns with a fingertip, remembering the math homework done on our dining table, the same wood now holding proof that some lessons were never learned. There's a kind of hunger you can feed, and there's the kind that eats a name. I felt the difference settle like iron. If greed had been a rumor, here it had handwriting. You see the motive, Stephen said. I did, and I hated that I did. Stephen clicked another file. Dan again, this time with planning in his mouth. After Dad. "We handle Mom," he said. "Make it look like a suicide widow grief. Everybody understands." Mike asked about notes, about timing, about finding me. I tasted metal and realized I'd been holding myself too still to breathe. "We won't let it get that far," Stephen said, hand light on the folder like a benediction. The tape continued my name, my habits, discussed like vulnerabilities in a wall. I remembered teaching them the difference between honesty and secrecy, how secrets rot and truth breathes. They had chosen rot. The worst part wasn't the danger, it was the fluency with which they spoke about ending the woman who once taught them to tie their shoes. Fear sharpened into clarity. "We go to the police tonight," I said. Stephen nodded. "When love can't protect, it must testify." I gathered the pages like a shield and stood. The station's fluorescent lights hummed like a hive. Sergeant O'Connell met us at the door. His eyes took in the folder, then the way I held it. We laid everything out: recordings, photos, receipts, transcripts. The DA was called in from his late dinner, napkin still creasing his tie. Procedure unfolded with the calm of a well-practiced hymn chain of custody. Evidence logs, signatures neat and square. We requested an emergency order to preserve hospital records, to flag the death certificate, to schedule an exhumation. The DA listened to Dan saying methanol, to Mike saying in Dad's coffee, without interrupting. People who work with truth develop a stillness I envied. When it was time to sign my statement, my hand trembled and then remembered its work. "We'll move before dawn," the DA said, quietly. I looked at the clock mounted over the flag. Night has a way of stretching, but justice had put on its shoes. It would not be late. Plans love early hours. Patrol cars idled low behind the station. Radios whispered names, streets, the choreography of arrest. Stephen spread a map on the hood and tapped 2 addresses. O'Connell checked his watch and nodded to the teams. I stood to the side, an old woman in a good coat, feeling both too small and too necessary. Fear visited like a draft around the ankles. Resolve tucked the blanket tighter. "You don't have to be here," Stephen offered. "I was here for their first cries." I said, "I'll be here for this." The convoy rolled out, red and blue sleeping in their sockets. On the ride back to my kitchen, Stephen kept the radio low. Dispatch murmured updates like a distant tide. I poured us both water that tasted like metal and relief. "You're not alone," he said. I believed him. The sky thinned from ink to slate. Somewhere. Birds rehearsed dawn like they trusted it to arrive. Before the sun cleared the roofs, my phone rang. Dan's number. I let it ring twice so my voice would sound ordinary. "Mom, come to Mike's now. Something's wrong." His urgency was a performance I'd taught him for school plays. "I'm on my way," I lied, and set the phone down as if it might bite. Stephen met my eyes. We didn't need words. Outside. Far sirens braided into purposeful sound. I sat at the table where we once sorted Halloween candy and watched the second hand mark my refusal. The urge to run, to confront, to demand truth face to face, a mother's reflex, rose and passed like weather. I stayed. The house held me upright, on the counter. Ed's letter waited like a hand on my back. Let them walk into the truth. I whispered to the quiet room. The kettle clicked off. Somewhere beyond my walls, doors would open, names would be spoken, and the day would begin taking its shape. By 7:30, tires hissed on wet street outside. Minutes later, dispatch confirmed what the sirens had promised Dan in cuffs. Mirrored by his own front window, Mike trying the back fence like a boy late for curfew, stopped by a voice with authority in it. I pictured the scene with the fidelity of a mother's imagination, belts surrendered. Phones bagged, expressions learning the first syllables of consequence. Stephen's text was simple, both in custody. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd loaned the night. They ran. He added, "Of course they did. Men who sprint from truth forget it runs longer." I poured the untouched bakery coffee down the drain and watched it circle away. A small ceremony for a poison that never found my mouth. On the porch, the maple shook off last night's worry. I stood under its insistence and let the morning name me something I hadn't felt in weeks safe enough to plan. At the station, papers waited with straight spines. My name, my statement, the charges lined up like sober ushers' first-degree murder. Conspiracy, evidence tampering. The pen felt heavier than it should, as if aware of the ceremony of ink. My hand shook once, then steadied. I wrote like a woman who has stitched hems, in poor light, careful, true, through the glass. I glimpsed Dan being led down a corridor, shoulders squared against the wall of what comes next. Mike followed, chin up, a boy trying to balance manhood and fear. I did not wave. A mother's love doesn't vanish, it hardens into boundary. O'Connell thanked me in that quiet way good men do. Stephen touched the folder and said, "We keep going." I nodded. From my sons to the defendants is a bridge no one should have to cross. I crossed it with my husband's letter in my pocket and the word justice learning my name. The order came through, and with it, a morning that tasted like metal. They lifted what love had already let go, and science took its careful portion. Days later, the toxicology report arrived, a page of numbers clean as winter. Methanol present at lethal concentration, metabolites consistent with ingestion, timeline aligning with observed symptoms. No poetry, no comfort, just the cold mercy of fact. I read the summary twice, then a third time, the way you read a name on a headstone until it stops blurring. "This clears him," Stephen said softly. "Clears him of accident, of rumor, of any story smaller than murder." I pressed my palm to the paper as if warmth could bless it. In court, this would not weep or tremble. It would simply stand and point. That is the service truth renders. It refuses to be polite when something sacred has been broken. "Thank you," I whispered to a room that didn't need thanks. By the first day of trial, word had braided itself through town. The gallery filled with faces from grocery aisles and school concerts, neighbors who knew our porch light and our Christmas wreath. Reporters unfolded tripods like strange insects and compared notes over coffees they didn't finish. A headline on a folded paper near my seat caught my eye: "Sons accused in father's death." Another, hungrier, didn't bother with soft edges, patricide in Spring Creek. The syllables felt too big for our little place. I smoothed my skirt and rehearsed breathing. Across the aisle, Dan and Mike entered in chains that clicked like punctuation. Their eyes found the floor, then an invisible middle distance where excuses live. I wished them courage to tell the truth and knew they wouldn't. The judge entered, we rose, the room settled into its solemn spine. I set Ed's letter in my purse like a hand to hold and faced what was next. The prosecutor rose with the steady cadence of a man who has put on integrity daily for years. He did not thunder. He arranged facts the way a carpenter squares a frame true, level, patient. On the screen, the first audio file began, Dan's voice. "I already have the methanol." Subtitles stamped the words we could not pretend away. Mike's followed tomorrow, in Dad's coffee. Each sentence landed like a mallet, not loud but unarguable. The jurors' pens moved in small, stunned choreography. The prosecutor traced the timeline: policy increases, withdrawals, the too clean shop, the hospital intake, the exhumation, photos, receipts, call logs. Evidence stood in line without fidgeting. He didn't ask the jury to hate my sons. He asked them to look and keep looking. "This case is not about grief," he said. "It is about choice." My throat tightened. Love recognizes truth even when it hurts. Justice requires us to say the hurt out loud. When they called my name, my legs remembered both the porch steps and the hospital hallway. I took the oath with a voice I'd taught to hold lullabies and hard news. On the stand, I spoke about bread dough rising under a dish towel, about a tin roof that sang us to sleep, about Ed's laugh when the radio tuned right. Then I told them about paper policies that grew teeth, signatures that limped, withdrawals that didn't belong. I described the shop without a single scorch mark. The phone that shook in my hand at the graveside. The text that rearranged my marrow. I told them how a mother can love and still set a boundary. How love without truth is sentiment, and truth without love is a blade. Together, they become a spine. My hands worried my wedding band and then let it rest. When I finished, the room felt smaller and truer, like a stitched hem that finally lies flat. The medical examiner spoke with the humility of someone who knows bones and blood will outlast our stories. He unfolded diagrams methanol's path through the body, the slow betrayal of the optic nerve, the acid our cells cannot abide. He matched timestamps onset of confusion, the window to antidote, the moment after which mercy is only keeping a heartbeat company. He explained why early symptoms mimic stroke, why a rushed narrative is a killer's friend. Then the lab report quantified levels consistent with ingestion, absence of trauma consistent with no explosion, findings consistent with poison. The word consistent became a drum that steadied the room. Defense tried to widen gaps. The doctor narrowed them with facts you could build a bridge on. Science cannot speak to motive, he said, but it can speak to means and cause. On his last line, the air shifted. The story my sons had constructed couldn't stand in that light. Their lawyers worked the edges like tailors trying to make a suit. Fit a truth it wasn't cut for. Desperation. One suggested, outside influences. The other tried. Gestures toward debts and bad friends and city shadows. But the recordings didn't blink. The receipts didn't blush. The exhumation didn't apologize for arriving late. When they hinted I had imagined things, the prosecutor pressed play again, and Dan's own voice answered for me. Olivia sat still as a figurine, a gloss of sorrow on a face that reflected only itself. Mike stared at his hands like they belonged to a stranger. Dan stared at a future shrinking to the size of a cell. Hunger isn't homicide, the prosecutor said on cross. Choice is. The jury nodded in small, human ways, the way people do when they recognize the shape of a lie and the scaffolding of a life that has been patiently, precisely broken. Judge Karen Miller's gavel sounded like the end of a long winter. The jury filed in with faces that had learned wait. The foreman stood, throat cleared, paper unfolded. On the charge of first-degree murder of Edward Hayes guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder against Margaret Hayes guilty. The words did not rejoice, they relieved. The judge spoke of life terms, of parole years counted like distant stars, of restitution that cannot restore. I felt my knees consider the floor and then choose my chair. Stephen's hand remained a respectful inch from mine, steady as a rail, across the room. A sound left Mike half sob, half surrender. Dan's shoulders fell in on themselves, a tent collapsing after the storm. Justice came late, yes, but whole. I closed my eyes and thanked God for a truth that stood up on its own legs and for the strength to stand beside it. Freedom after a verdict is a quieter thing than you'd think. No parade, no brass, just the echo of shoes in a corridor and the tremble of hands meeting a doorknob. I walked out with Stephen and let the sun name my face again. Reporters asked for statements. I offered one sentence. We told the truth. At home. I set the life insurance check on the table and felt the heat of it, as if paper could carry stains. Money can be a salve or a scar. I chose neither. I endorsed it to a new account in a new name. The Ernest Hayes Foundation. Grants for families pressing charges against the people they once set plates for. Vouchers for counseling and investigators where storms have blown the roof off trust. Blood doesn't buy silence here. Our brochure will say, I made tea, wrote bylaws in my tidy hand, and felt something loosen in my chest that wasn't grief. It was purpose. We cleared the shop one soft Saturday, neighbors arriving with rakes and memories. The concrete remembered footsteps, but it didn't argue when we brought in soil. I set sunflower starts along the fence faces that insist on light, and tucked white daisies by the door where the bell used to ring. A hand-painted sign says, Edie's Garden. Children came with watering cans too big for them and made a mess that felt holy. I planted a rosebush for vows kept and marigolds for protection. Old country wisdom in bright skirts. When the wind moves through, the leaves clatter like small applause. Sometimes I stand where the workbench was and close my eyes. I can still smell oil and hear a whistle off-key. I run my palm over the air where his tools used to hang, and in that empty space, I feel something sturdy answer back. The robins know this place now. They hop along the border stones like little foremen. Once, I found a single screw in the soil. Worn smooth by years, it felt like a blessing in my hand. Grief becomes a trellis if you let it. Love climbs. And when the late sun turns the petals to coins, I rest my weight on the shovel and remember we did the best we could with what we had. And somehow, it was enough. Peace didn't arrive as silence. It came with sounds I could live inside Linda's knock. Stephen's footsteps on my porch, the kettle's bright announcement. We drink coffee that tastes like safety and talk about ordinary things, the stubborn maple, the thrift store lamp that finally works, the letter from a woman our foundation helped last week. Sometimes we sit without fixing anything, two people, and a quiet that doesn't bite. In the evenings, I sew again, not for money, but for the small joy of joining what belongs together. Thread goes through, fabric yields, and a line holds. It reminds me I can hold, too. I read the Psalms out loud and let the house answer in creaks I recognize by heart. I still miss the boys, they were freckled, sticky, racing the dusk, but I no longer grieve the men they chose to become. When memory tries to bruise me, I bless the child they once were and return the man to consequence. Boundaries have given my love a spine. Family, I've learned, is not the people who share your blood. It's the people who share your duty of care. On good days, the window lifts without sticking, and a sweet, ordinary breeze crosses the room. When the curtain billows and then rests, I think of Ed and feel the weather change inside me steadier, kinder, like a forecast I can finally believe. I lost a husband, and then more slowly the sons I once knew, but I kept the truth. I kept my name, love. I've learned, needs boundaries to stand upright. Justice is simply love wearing its work clothes for those who remain. I smooth the ribbon on these flowers and thank the man who taught me that decency is a daily chore, not a speech. The garden is growing where the shop once stood. The house is quiet, but not empty. Peace lives here, now earned, not given. If you have felt that cold shift in your own home, the hush before a storm, the ache of doubt, you are not alone. There is a way that does not ask you to lie for the people you love. Hold your line, ask the hard questions, choose the truth that lets you sleep. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you'd like more stories of truth and healing, stay with me, there's more ahead.